This is the Gateway E-4100, a business-class desktop computer from 2004. This PC is one that I've had for a really long time. I got it in 2017 for free. It was originally purchased by a relative who used it for a couple years and then put it in storage until I eventually ended up with it. And that's about all I know for this system. Information for these is sparse, and I don't exactly think they were super successful since I haven't found very many of them on the used market. But according to Gateway, this was branded as a small/mid-sized business machine, and so it had a lot of different customization options. But as far as I'm aware, this was actually purchased from Best Buy back in the day, and its hardware selection appears to have been customized because my configuration of this machine is not listed anywhere on this website. My machine came equipped with an Intel Pentium 4 HT CPU clocked at 3 GHz, 512 MB of DDR400 RAM, a 120 GB hard drive, a DVD-ROM CDRW combo drive, as well as a floppy drive, an NVIDIA GeForce FX 5200 GPU, and, in addition, a creative audio card, and Windows XP Professional. In other words, this is one of the highest-end E-4100s that Gateway appears to have offered. The closest options I can find that resemble my system start at over $1,000, and that's before even adding any of the video or audio cards or the larger hard drive. And this PC was purchased with a monitor as well, so this would have been pretty expensive when it was new. I finally got the site to load. This is the custom build your own system page, if you couldn't tell, with all of the various options that you could have gotten with this computer. There are a lot of things. There are a lot of things like USB drives, and you could have gotten an external zip drive, external hard drive, surge protectors. But the stuff that we're interested in is up here. I've customized the CPU, RAM, hard drive, things like that, as close as I can to the original parts in this system. There's a lot of stuff here. You could have gotten a second hard drive, a DVD RW drive, and an additional CD RW drive or another DVD-ROM drive, and you could have gotten up to a Radeon 9600G, probably the Gateway OEM variant since this is called the FX 5200G. Sound Blaster Audigy 2, kind of peripherals you could have gotten as well. So there's a lot of stuff here. Now this, before I've done anything, starts at $1,100, and unfortunately, this does not update automatically. Instead, you're supposed to make your changes and click Update Total, which on this old website just doesn't do anything. But I have come up with the numbers myself, and it's about $1,500. Because I'm tired while I'm editing this, I probably forgot something in there, but that should give you a rough idea of how much this was new, which is not cheap. Still, back in 2004 when this was new, this would have been a pretty good computer, even if it wasn't very good for very long. It certainly looks like it was designed to be sitting in an office all day. The case is very plain, and yet there's also some pretty quirky things going on at the same time. For example, there's a big component door on the chassis. Not really sure why, but there is. Certainly a bit unique, but honestly, when it's closed, I kind of think it makes this case look ugly. So I pretty much leave it open all the time. I think it looks better. Now obviously under this door, there are two 5¼ inch bays, as well as two external 3½ inch bays, a blank for an optional FireWire port, not equipped on this obviously, and two USB 2.0 ports, as well as the power button below that. Rather unusually, there is no hard drive activity LED on this case. Instead, you get a dual color power LED. So, cool. Towards the bottom of the case is where you'd find the audio ports, not equipped on mine, and, in my case, the remnants of the Pentium 4 and Windows XP stickers. On the back is the Gateway information sticker, as well as the power supply, of course. The Windows XP Professional product key, PS2 keyboard and mouse ports, 4 USB 2.0 ports, serial, parallel, and VGA ports, 2 more USB 2.0 ports, an Ethernet port, and 2-channel audio. There's also a rear exhaust vent which can mount either an 80 or a 92mm case fan. And for the expansion I/O, there's an S-Video port and a VGA port, some FireWire ports, the 2-channel audio port sound card, and the modem. One nice thing is that the expansion cards are entirely toolless, so that's convenient. In fact, this entire chassis is toolless. Rather than being held on by screws, the side panel has a release latch on top. Otherwise, the side panel is a pretty typical OEM way of bolting a big old piece of plastic onto a sheet of metal. With the side panel off, it really exposes how much smaller the actual chassis is, and how much of it is just plastic that's been attached to it. But anyways, this power supply is original. It has a built-in test switch and status LED, and also rather unusually, its cooling fan is external. This is the Newton Power NPS 250HB, which seems to be a pretty good quality power supply. I've never had any problems with it. It's freaking heavy, for one thing. It's fully standard and everything. It will work on our computer. It's just that because of the cooling fan being external, it's technically a bit taller, so it might not fit in certain cases. It does have an AT power connector though, so I guess that makes up for it. The toollessness keeps on going with the drive bays. There are no screws required for any of these drives, which is pretty convenient. The one thing is the mechanism for the hard drive cage broke off a long time ago, but honestly it's still relatively secure even as is. Now as for the motherboard area, this is a micro ATX board from Intel themselves, so I'm sure it's not shocking at all that this has a socket 478 Intel Pentium 4 CPU. In fact, pretty much all of the hardware on this board is Intel, including the 865G chipset and an Intel Gigabit Ethernet controller, which is pretty nice for the time. This board has 4 RAM slots for a max of 4 GB of RAM. Originally, only 2 of these slots were populated, but I decided to populate every one of them with 1 GB modules for the max amount of 4 gigs, because why not? This board also has an AGP slot and 3 PCI slots. Every single one of them is occupied in this case, though I should point out the FireWire card was something I added. The rest of the cards were factory to this computer. Additionally, there are also 2 SATA ports on this board, though the power supply has no SATA power connectors, so some adapters will be required. Otherwise, this board was clearly customized for this case. This is the Intel D865GLC, and not only does it have some customizations to the BIOS, but it also only has the specific I/O headers for this case. For example, the lack of audio ports means there is no front audio header on this board at all. But this board can be put into another computer, and this case can take another board, with the one exception being the rear I/O was specifically stamped for this case, so you would have to cut out an I/O shield spot. So it's a bit of work, but sadly it's not the worst I've seen. But we're not quite done with this case yet. First of all, you may notice there is no rear cooling fan. There's a couple things I think may have influenced this. First of all, this motherboard, while it does have another fan header, doesn't actually provide this header with enough voltage to spin a fan under normal circumstances, and it only really gives it enough voltage when the system actually gets warm and the CPU fan starts getting more power itself. So, for the most part, it's kind of just a waste. In fact, it's likely why the power supply cooling fan is external, because it's acting as an exhaust fan to push air out the back of the power supply rather than out the back of the case. Which is technically valid, not really the way I would have wanted to do that, since shooting hot Pentium 4 air into a power supply doesn't seem like a smart idea, but that's how they did it. We're still not quite done yet. This chassis had an intrusion switch at one point, but I took it out because it got in the way. The plastic blanks for the unused drive bays are actually full caddies with a piece of plastic attached to them, which is a interesting approach. This base on the bottom can be removed, but it is required for operation, and so you're not supposed to take it off. Probably because without it, there would be no access to any intake on this entire chassis, which seems bad. The component door can be removed, it's just held in with a metal rod, but to be honest, removing it somehow makes the case look even weirder, so I leave it in. And finally, the rest of the plastic panels come off, but they don't really reveal anything super useful. Whew. Yeah, this case definitely has some unique things about it. And so does this system's BIOS. First of all, it doesn't report the CPU type correctly, which is funny. Aside from the typical I/O options that you might expect, this BIOS does also have some options for if certain components are not functioning. For example, if you don't have a keyboard or mouse plugged in, or if any of your drives stop working, the system will throw an error and it won't boot. It's just kind of annoying because this only works if you have PS2 peripherals. If you have a USB keyboard or mouse plugged in, the system will beep at you anyway. And the OS on this computer is Windows XP. I don't have the original install for a pretty interesting reason why. I'll explain in a little while. But I found some gateway media that works perfectly on this computer, and later I found the E-4100 applications disk, so pretty much all the software is basically stuff that would have come with this computer new. Which there is a lot of. There's Adobe Reader, America Online, Big Fix, which, like the MX6440, doesn't work at all. A basic version of Nero, Microsoft Money, Microsoft Works, Music Match Jukebox, which doesn't even open at all, Power DVD, QuickTime 6.5, Real Player 8 Basic, and Microsoft Picture It Photo Premium 9. There's also software on this for a Microsoft mouse. Maybe it was an add-on when this was new. Intel ProSet's also on the system. There's a shortcut to do more with Gateway, which doesn't work at all. The various Gateway documentation, one of which is literally just how to use Windows XP, while the other is the more useful stuff for this computer. There's a Gateway Ink monitor, the Gateway Driver and Application Recovery Program, and finally, PC Doctor. Not mentioned here is Norton Antivirus, which is pretty typical on any OEM PC, but on this computer specifically, there is a problem with Norton Antivirus present where occasionally it will pin the CPU at 100% all of the time. That makes this thing basically unusable for literally no reason. And this only went away when I uninstalled Norton, which is just the most insane problem that I think I've ever had with bloatware in a long time. In my opinion, that's enough of a reason there to entirely forego any OEM install on this computer, especially because none of the software is actually unique to this computer. Most of the stuff you could download and install on your own, and the few gateway things that are there really aren't that helpful. Now, I'm sure it's probably obvious a Pentium 4 is not going to be doing any modern tasks today. It wasn't doing them 10 years ago. So everything that's going to be done on this computer is going to be offline tasks, which there isn't a lot of use for these days. But for Windows XP stuff, this computer is far from the worst. That's about the highest praise I can give it. Most benchmarks aren't really a fair comparison since I don't have a lot of data for hardware from this age, but that doesn't mean I didn't try anyway. In this case, it places around the eMachine's M6805 with the Athlon 64 and Radeon 9600. And obviously the HP DC 7600 with the Pentium D completely blows it out of the water. Since I was bored and didn't have anything else to compare it to, I decided to take out the FX 5200 and try the integrated graphics and see what it would score. But this actually leads me into another problem with this, which is that the drivers for the video kinda suck. Any of the drivers I found on this driver disk are from 2003, so beforehand I updated the NVIDIA driver to the latest one so that the performance wouldn't be terrible. This Intel driver is a lot harder though, because Intel doesn't have any of their old resources available anymore and Gateway hasn't in a long time, so the only driver for this is either the Microsoft driver or the ancient video driver from the Gateway driver disk, which unsurprisingly doesn't really produce any results of value. Basically what I'm trying to say is I wasted half an hour of my time. I did also try an old version of PC Mark on this system, but because it's missing some dependencies, it produced inconclusive results, so I'll have to come back to that another time. The FX5200 is kind of a joke, but in my opinion it's still better that it's here than not. It does give this thing a little bit of graphics power, even if the GPU could be improved a lot. It does mean that while the experience is not great, this computer can play old games. I didn't do a lot of this testing, but I did try a couple things, and well, things were at least playable. It's obviously not what this was originally supposed to be either. Again, this was an office PC, but personally I like to get distracted while working, so doesn't mean I can't try to game on it anyway. Now, something I haven't mentioned until now is thermals. This CPU is a Northwood, not a Prescott, so the thermals are actually pretty good on this thing. Well, for a Pentium 4 anyway. Prescott CPUs were offered in these PCs, but this was from July of 2004, so it just barely predates Prescott. Running Cinebench, the system peaked at about 60 degrees for the CPU, and removing the side panel produced pretty much exactly the same result. So this pretty simple cooling setup appears to be doing the trick, and that's about all you can ask for. As for the fan, well, every time the BIOS is initialized, the fans are maxed out. This is only really a problem in my case because the cooling fan's bearings are actually starting to fail. And also, the fans in this machine have a weirdly car-like engine sound to it. It's actually the power supply fan specifically that sounds this way. It's not super annoying, but it is unusual for a computer. At idle, the fan runs at about 1000 RPM, but of course under load it's going to be higher. This is where those bearings start kicking in again. One thing to note is that the reporting from either the fan or the board itself is inconsistent, since it was reporting numbers as high as 3500, followed by a drop-off back to 1000, then back up to something high. Just changes in the RPM that didn't really make any sense, and could be disputed with something called my ears. I don't have a physical tach, so I guess we'll never know, but I'd say it's probably running around 2000 RPM. Either way, it's not that loud compared to what it could be. Finally, I thought I would touch on the drives in the system because none of them are good. Starting with the hard drive, this is a Maxtor Diamond Max Plus 9. If you couldn't tell, it's original to this computer. This drive has multiple bad things about it. Number one. Number two, it is really loud. And number three, this drive likes to corrupt itself out of nowhere, make it seem like it's failing until you reformat it, and then suddenly it's fine. Remember how I said I don't have the OEM install? It's because that's precisely what happened to it. I have other issues with this drive, but I feel like I can stop there because that's probably enough on its own. So obviously I put a different hard drive in this computer instead. The original DVD-ROM CDRW combo drive is manufactured by Hitachi LG. It is the GCC4481B. It's a pretty quiet drive, but that's because it has a lot of problems actually detecting media properly. This is supposed to be a 16x DVD drive, and yet it's lucky if it can even achieve half of that speed. Most of the time, it's closer to 2 to 4x DVD read speed, which for a 2004 optical drive is horrible. It also almost always actually fails to complete any test, and every time I've tried to do a test on it, it produces entirely different results. And this drive has another unique problem, which is it will not read any CD properly at all. This is officially the first optical drive I have ever owned, in which it is explicitly only a DVD drive and does not read CDs as well. The only CDs I've been able to get this drive to read are pressed discs. Anything I've ever burned just shows up as blank. And no, the CD writing functionality does not work on this drive either. Since it technically half worked, what I did is I bought another Gateway OEM drive from Hitachi LG that is basically the same thing except it's a CD-ROM drive instead of a DVD drive, which is something I can't say I've ever had to do before. This is the GCR8483B, and, well, it works, but this drive is also extremely inconsistent. While it sounds like it's working on the surface, take a listen to the sound that the drive is making while it's reading a disc. This drive is not able to keep a constant speed. In fact, if you look at the graph, it's far from it. It does work, it's just really annoying in the process. It's the same problem I had with the DVD drive, which is anytime I try and test this drive, any results it produces are completely inconsistent from the last set of tests I did on it. But I'm not done yet. Depending on the disc you put in this thing, sometimes it'll sound like this. And finally, the floppy drive is an NEC part. It's the FD1231M, and it's probably the most functional of any of these drives. The only real issue with it is it does struggle to format disks, likely because this drive was really dirty when I got this computer. Whew, I think that's it. There's a lot to unpack with this computer. I feel like it goes without saying since I've kept it as long as I have, but I like this thing a lot actually. It's a weird and quirky little thing, and like I said, they don't seem to be super common used, at least not for cheap. For a Windows 2000 or XP box, there's really not a lot of components that have to be changed, other than maybe that GPU. This could maybe use a better audio card. The Creative Audio PCI in this is pretty basic, but my stance on these is that they're still more interesting than just the integrated solutions. Most of the problems that I've ever ran into with this computer are mainly to do with the components, and that's almost certainly specific to this computer. And of course, it's really easy to replace all those parts because everything is toolless. There's headroom to make the existing hardware even better, and there's possibilities to gut all of it and use the case for something more modern. My only other complaint is I hate the software for it, but again, that's a pretty easy thing to fix. Against all odds, this Pentium 4 box with the components it has works pretty well as is though. My biggest concern when I first got this computer was going to be thermals, especially since this had a pretty high-end Pentium 4, and I can't vouch to what it would be like with a Prescott CPU. But at least this computer with the Northwood setup works pretty well.